Hi everyone. Today I'm going to talk to you about Chapter 9 or Individual Decision Making. I'm just going to start by talking a little bit about where we're up to in the subject and in terms of our learning in the text, and then I'm going to talk about the things I'd like you to take out of the reading this week and for this particular chapter of the textbook. So far we've been learning about things that influence consumers, the reasons why they do things in consumer behaviour. And now we're going to, like attitudes and emotions and how people learn and that sort of thing. So now we're going to turn to looking at how the process of decision making that people go through. Now, often we talk about the phrase, it depends in marketing. Everything we do depends on multiple things. And you'll find that as we talk about this chapter, the way people move through decision making and the decision processes that they engage in really depend on the different situations people are in, the different purchases that they're making. And we're going to talk about that in a bit more detail. Okay, so let's just quickly look at the objectives of this week's learning. Just move the slide forward. Okay, so when you finish this lecture or when you finish your reading, you should understand the three different types of consumer decisions, so extended, limited and habitual. The three roles consumers take in decision making as emotion experiences, habitual, actors and problem solvers. We're going to talk about consumer decision-making theories to explain why people exert extra effort or look for convenience. And then we'll finish up with talking about mental biases in consumer decisions. I might actually get to that in today. I might just encourage you to read that in the text. So let's start by looking at the types of consumer decisions people engage in. I just might move me out of the way for a second. So essentially there's three. They are extended problem solving, limited problem solving and habitual decision making. Now, I've tried to put an image here that sort of reflects the nature of each of them. So I guess what differentiates between these different types of decision making are a couple of things. And I'll talk to them in a minute. But essentially, extended problem solving is when you engage in things like buying a house, just as it sounds, when you've got to go through extra processes. And it's a big decision. It's often what's different between these, before I get to the next slide, is sometimes the level of risk, the level of financial risk that you're engaging in. So these pictures are meant to reflect buying a house, being on a streaming device, deciding which streaming service to use, and the third one is just buying milk, so you have a habitual decision. So there's a big difference in terms of the amount of financial risk that you're engaging in to make each of those purchases. There's also, some of them are more revocable than others. If you buy some milk and it's out of date, it doesn't matter too much, does it? You might be happy about it, but you haven't outlaid a lot of money. But if you buy a house, it's quite an irrevocable, it's hard to undo that decision. And you're going to lose money as a result of it. So that makes a big difference to the decision that you're engaging in, the level of risk associated with it. If you're purchasing a streaming device, realistically, you might pay for one extra month. It's not a streaming device, a streaming service. You might pay for one extra month of the service, but it's not too hard to irrevoke, and too hard to change. And if you go and buy toothpaste and you're not happy with it, I guess you could return it if you chose to. Some decisions are easier to undo than others. Now, sorry, I just want to check my notes. Okay. Another thing is how often you engage in the decision. You don't buy a house very often, but you probably buy milk weekly or more. So sometimes the more often you engage in something, the more familiar it is, the easier it is to make the decisions because you've gone through the process of deciding before. Also, there's not many choices, is there? You can go to the milk, milk choices have increased, but still you can go and choose light or full cream. You can choose to buy it from, Woolies or Coles or from the farm, other producers, Farmer's Own, for example. Or you can choose, there's a few other options, aren't there, with like A2 milk and your lactose-free milk, and okay, there's a few different options there, but generally you know what you're looking for. But with a house, or even with a streaming service, there's a lot more criteria that come into making that decision. The location, the price, whether or not you can afford it, whether or not it has enough bedrooms, whether or not it's big enough or small enough. So you can see how extended problem solving has a lot more factors at play. Limited problem solving has a few less, and habitual problem solving is a lot easier to do. So let's have a look at the next slide where it lays this out a bit better for you. Okay, so this is a nice continuum of the buying decision behavior. Okay, so habitual behaviors tend to be low cost, frequent purchases, low consumer involvement. So you're not supremely invested in your purchase. They're familiar product classes and brands, and there's little thought or search that goes into the time given to make the purchase. You know, if you go to the supermarket, you can buy milk, but you might spend a fair bit of time, you know, looking for the right place to buy the house, or looking for the right streaming service, depending on what programs it offers, for example. Now, extensive problem solving has more expensive products, it's less frequent, higher consumer involvement, it's unfamiliar, and you go through a really extensive thought, like information search, and a longer process to make the purchase. So it's important to think about, when you're thinking about your consumers to purchase decision, you need to understand where your product sits on this continuum for your consumers. Excuse me. Now, within consumer behavior theory, consumers can be thought of as problem solvers. That's one of the consistent ways of, well, I guess the way I want you to think about this is there's different, I'm just going to pause this for 2 seconds. There's different ways that consumer behavior researchers have looked at the consumer in the past. They've considered them as rational problem solvers who go through a rational decision-making process, emotion experiences who, you know, engage in impulse purchasing, or habitual actors. Now, the way we think about the processes that each of these types of consumer go through, and the way we investigate or interrogate what happened, not interrogate, but investigate how consumers engage in those behaviors varies. I'm just going to talk about each in a little bit more detail now. I guess the other thing to be aware of is that consumers can switch between each of these roles depending on the context and the product. Remember, we talked earlier in the session about situational influences. So the situation, whether you purchase, say, think about task-based influences, for example. So if you're purchasing something for a friend versus purchasing it for yourself, or purchasing it for a gift or for your workplace, all of those things impact on how you make the decision. So think about that as well. All right, let's move on to the next. So let's start by thinking about consumers as emotion experiences. So emotions are one source of information that we can draw on to make decisions. So this approach, or way of conceptualizing the decision maker, suggests that decisions are made on the basis of how we feel about an item. So people might talk about this as, you know, that notion of heart versus head, or a gut feeling, or instinct. Emotion is social information. So this model explains how others use our emotions to make decisions and judgments as well. And people are influenced through inferential processes, so deciding what to buy or what not to buy, or affective reactions. So for example, posting your own comment about it. Now, I would encourage you to go and have a read about this in the textbook. I've only just covered it briefly. Now, I did write down we'll get to it in a minute, but let me just find the page so I can send you to the right place. So the reading about this starts on about page 290 and goes to about 292. So you'll notice in the text, and I've probably talked about this before, but they have large blue headings, and they have orange headings, and then they have small blue headings. And so look for the large blue headings. That's what these come under. Okay, let's go to talk about consumers as habitual actors. So if we think about habitual decision making, we suggest it occurs with little or no conscious effort. Consumers make low involvement decisions, and it's a learned response to environmental cues in a store. For example, the design of the retail outlet. But context does matter, and we can use that, marketers do try and use that to their advantage. So consumers can be primed to respond to things without a conscious thought. So for example, I could have put a packet of chips on each page and then asked you what sort of chips you felt like in this presentation. And based on priming theory, it would suggest that the first thing that would pop into your head would be that image you've been seeing. So marketers do that by manipulating the environment, framing the perspective. So for example, that 95% fat-free or 5% fat, my mum always thinks it's a great bargain if she got the $300 off, as opposed to it costing $100. Retail stores are designed to generate movement in a certain way as well. So think about IKEA as the big example we always use of that. So when marketers are investigating this, they sort of adopt this behavioural approach to explaining consumer behaviour. So rather than asking consumers what they did or why they did it, they just use observations and try and predict observations and modelling to try and predict behaviour. So think about the data that you give when you use your everyday rewards card or your Flybuys card or your loyalty card wherever you go. So now instead of asking people and doing surveys and doing focus groups, organizations are able to just use their bank of data about a consumer to make predictions about how they're going to behave. And sometimes there is this contention in the literature or argument that the best measure of what somebody's going to do in the future is what they did in the past. Past behavior is a better gauge of what people are going to do than behavioral intention, for example. Okay, so I encourage you to have a look at French's exchange framework. So this talks about different ways that we can influence behavior, and they talk about a hug, a smack, a shove, and a nudge. And they talk about this across two axes, an axis of what they're calling valence, but reward and punishment, or cognitive engagement, whether they're actively engaged or passively engaged. Now, I'm not going to go right into this now. I encourage you to go to, I think this is on page 294. So have a read about French's framework, and then have a look at this notion of nudging. This is something that we hear talked about a fair bit at the moment, in the way that we slowly or subtly shift people towards making a purchase. I think about this in terms of the everyday rewards when they say, oh, we've picked out these items for you. Why don't you purchase those and you'll get more points this week? That nudges me towards making a purchase that I mightn't have made before. Now, I do encourage you, while you're reading this, on page 295, there's a marketing pitfall little box. Read that, because it will mention to you, it sort of suggests some of the negatives of engaging in nudging and how you need to be careful that consumers don't think you're being condescending or patronizing them or manipulating them. It's about getting nudging right, I guess. But it's interesting to think about that. The notion of a smack, we were talking recently in something I was doing about how we wanted to motivate people with a smack, but I find that a bit hard. But that's really about that negative reinforcement. So think back to your learning theory where we talked about operant conditioning, instrumental conditioning, or classical conditioning. I think the smack is a bit like that negative instrumental conditioning. There's a fine, a late fee, something like that. All right, so moving on. Another way of thinking about consumers is as problem solvers. Now, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking here because this is going to be relevant for your assignment. So a consumer purchase is a response to a problem, and most consumers go through a series of steps. Now, one famous model, and it's been around for a long time, is the EKB, or Engel, Collett and Blackwell model of consumer behaviour. Now, this has faced its criticisms. In that people don't always go through this process. People sometimes skip steps. Sometimes people engage in two steps at once. But it's a really nice, easy way to think about the processes that people go through and think about how you as a marketer can engage with people in each of these processes. Now, I'm going to skim through this a little bit because I've only got 3 minutes left. However, Chapter 10 talks about post-purchase outcomes, so we're not going to go through these. But essentially, this is a 5-step decision-making process. People first recognize there's a need between their ideal state and their actual state that's greater than they'd like it to be, and realize that they have to engage in some sort of processes to rectify that situation, and that's the start of the process. So that's where the problem comes in. Then once people do that, depending on whether this is an extended, limited or habitual decision, people may engage in information search. Now, people tend to seek information from internal and external sources of information to inform their decision, and then they tend to evaluate alternatives, and they do that using different criteria. Now, some would say that information search and evaluation of alternatives occurs at the same time. When you're reading, have a look at the discussion around around decision criteria. So we talk about this notion of the evoked set. Now, the evoked set is all the brands that you're aware of, and of all the brands you're aware of, some of them you're willing to consider, some of them you consider hopeless, inert, inept. There's no way you'd use them, and there's a set that sort of sit in the middle. So as a marketer, you need to understand where your product sits in terms of that spectrum of brands people are aware of. And you engage in different strategies depending on where you sit. But essentially, I guess the other thing I want to cover here is that people tend to have a set of criteria that they use to make decisions. It might, when we're talking about the house, it might have been price, number of rooms, location. And people have different rules that help them determine how, which of those, how to make a decision when they combine those criteria. Okay, finally, product choice. Product choice is the second last step, and there's lots of things that influence product choice. Like, for example, where people are going to buy it, those situational influences we talked about before, whether it's online or offline. And this is also where we consider the nature of the purchase environment. So the ambient things that we do and the way we change the environment that people are making the decisions in. Now, that's everything for today. I'm going to stop because I've only got 15 minutes. I'll talk to you in the next slide, next set of video.